Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
All right, greetings everyone and welcome back to another great episode of IT Pro TV. I'm your host Daniel Lowry. In today's episode we are continuing on, moving forward and trying to grapple all that is A+. That is the software side of things, 22902. And joining us back in the studio to help us out yet again, lend his expertise, our good friend Mr. Wes Bryan. Wes, we're so glad to have you back, man. How's it going?
Man, it's going great. Great to be here as always. And that's right, we are continuing on in installing Windows. Well, in the last episode, we talked a lot about, just some of the basics when it comes to installation, boot methods we talked about, where we can find these operating systems as far as the installation sources goes. And one of the things that we left off on was image deployment. I want to go ahead and I'm going to pick up right where we left off. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands, the process surrounding image deployment. So I got a little diagram here and just going to kind of recap. Remember, one of the things that we showed you is actually deploying an image from an image server. Keep in mind that what happens is that we have essentially a PXE communication that goes on, right? The operating system, or actually not, we don't even have an operating system. The network adapter through the BIOS or UEFI calls out to the network and says, hey, I need an operating system. Anybody out there got one? And then it's the deployment server, right? Doesn't matter what your deployment software is. We mentioned a few different kinds. We just happen to be using WDS or Windows Deployment Services here in the A+ as an example. The image gets deployed over to the network to a destination computer. It could be a series of computers too, so that's one of the benefits of doing this in a corporate environment. And then the image is installed, if you will, or unpacked to the hard drive. Keep in mind that this is something typically you find inside of your corporate environments. Now, image deployment isn't the only installation type that we need to be aware of. We also have some things that are specific to Windows, and really we have what are known as upgrade installations. We have what are known as clean installations. All right. So let's go ahead and let's talk about a clean installation. All right. A clean installation first. This is an installation type in which you have no operating system already on your hard drive.
Hence the term clean, right? There's nothing on there, nothing dirtying up your hard drive.
That's absolutely correct. And what it means is that you're going to format the hard drive and you're going to install, just like Dan said, a clean, fresh installation of the operating system. Now let me be careful on this because one of the things that I kind of said and technically isn't true is that you don't have an operating system already on your hard drive. You could. You could have something, let's say like Windows XP or Windows Vista on your already as an operating system, and you say, you know what, I want to move to Windows 8.1, but I don't need the old operating system. I don't need any of the files or anything like that. I don't need any of the applications. You know what? Because again, I want to do some spring cleaning and I want everything to be fresh. And what happens? Well, you go through your install process and you format the hard drive, you repartition everything, and it installs that operating system over the old one completely eliminating all of the old remnants of the hard drive. That's a clean installation. Now that has its benefits in the fact that, well, that's why I kind of mentioned the term spring cleaning. I know here, here at IT Pro TV, we like to do clean installations, right? When we muddy up an operating system. And what I mean by that is you use it, you're making configuration changes. I know we like to peek and tweak operating systems and kind of see what we can do with them, and sometimes we can break them with the best of them, right? But the thing is, when it comes time that you want to clean up the hard drive, essentially, or clean up the installation itself, we just reformat the hard drive and put a fresh installation of Windows or whatever your operating system might be. It just happens to be that we're talking about Windows here. All right. Now, where would the drawbacks be, right? Because that sounds like it's beneficial. Well, here's the drawbacks. If you got your applications already installed, right? You're in a business. Businesses spend a lot of money on your the applications that they have. Well, when you go to a new operating system and you do a clean install, you're going to lose those applications. And here's the thing too, you're also going to lose settings and you're going to lose any files that are associated, right? Unless you're keeping backups. And we'll talk about preventative maintenance in another episode, but keep in mind that when you do a clean installation, you lose your applications, you lose your settings, and you lose your files. Now, here's where the other type of installation comes in, and that's something known as an upgrade installation. All right. One of the things that Windows allows you to do is that if you want to install your operating system, but you want to keep certain things, you want to keep certain things on the hard drive. You want to keep your applications. You want to keep your settings, right? You potentially want to keep your files. Well, you can do what's known as an upgrade installation. Now, this is a little bit different in the fact that what you're going to do, it's kind of like the Russian dolls, a doll within inside a doll within inside a doll. What you're going to do is you're going to take that existing operating system and you're going to take a new operating system and you're going to lay its architecture right over the old one. All right. Now, it has benefits and it has drawbacks as well. It's no different, right? Everything in computing, just like anything else in life, has its pros and cons, right? Let's go ahead and get the pessimistic side out of the way, right? You don't get the benefit of the fresh operating system, fresh settings, you know, all clean, right? You get remnants of what you've done to the registry prior. That could be good, could be bad. Beneficial, though, is that depending on your upgrade type, right, what operating system you're going from, how old the oldest operating system is versus how new the new operating system is, you can retain your applications. Provided there isn't compatibility issues to begin with, you can retain the settings in the application sometimes, as well as retaining your data. Now, that could be beneficial. Where could that be beneficial? If you work for a company that has spent thousands of dollars, and in fact, we were talking about this in another episode, and Dan, you made a good point where you said hundreds of thousands of dollars on a line of business application, your company's probably going to want to get as much bang for their buck. They're going to want that application to last as long as it can before they're going to shell out cash like that to upgrade. This is where you get benefit. You do get a benefit. That if you do what's known as an upgrade, you install the new operating system on the old, you have the potential to save the applications. All right. So let's go ahead, and one of the things that I want to do is I want to show you, well, what would be the difference between the different types of installations? All right, well, when it comes to the different types of installations, it depends on which one it is that you're doing. So for instance, there are what's known as the clean install. All right, and when we do the clean install, you have to keep in mind that what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to have your installation media. All right. Now, your installation media could be the local source installation media that we talked about in the first part. It could be something like the deployment that we did. In fact, the deployment that we did was a clean installation. All right. You might hear the term bare metal installation, right? Bare metal installation, what does that mean? It means you've got a bare metal hard drive and there's nothing on it, no operating system, nothing, right? It's essentially a big, glorified, expensive paperweight, and you're going to install the operating system fresh to it. Let's go ahead and show you at least the starts of a clean installation. And what we're going to do is we're just going to, let's say, insert our optical media, and in this the play button for us is the power. And notice it says Windows is loading its files. This is the ISO file that we were talking about in the first part here that's actually loading the pre-installation environment into RAM. It's a small, streamlined operating system that doesn't survive reboots. And what does it do? It allows you to the other portions of the dresser, right, that we talked about with an ISO file. It's essentially a container that contains all the parts to build an operating system, install it on the local drive, just like buying a dresser that is pre-packaged, but you have to put it together.
So it's like an armoire. It's got doors that open, and then there's drawers.
That's right. That's exactly it. And then what you do is you open the drawers and pull the pieces and components you want, right? So here's where the basic installation comes in, right? Notice that we can this is the clean install. We can select our language here, right? In this case, it's going to be English for us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're watching from other countries, which we have viewers all around the world, just understand it's going to be contingent on the installation media that you have. All right? I mean, if you happen to be Korean, you're doing a Korean installation, then guess what? You're doing a European installation, then you're going to have an inversion. And it'll have the languages associated with that. All right, time, currency, and format, we're going to go ahead and leave it. Keep in mind we could change this, right, depending on where we're at. Same thing with the keyboard. For me, I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to choose next. Now, I want you to be careful on this next screen because we talked about a repair installation. In fact, I believe in other episodes, we've actually shown you booting into the recovery environment for the purposes of running something known as boot rec, right? Well, this is actually how you get into the recovery environment to do a repair installation right here. And if there was problems with the hard drive, problems with the operating system, we could do all various types of things. System restore, we could perform. Again, we could run the command prompt, if you will. We could do a startup repair and even go into the advanced boot options. All right, now, if you were preparing for this A+ exam, we want you to know the requirements for installing Windows. And the great thing is they've largely stayed the same since the days of Windows 7. Now, Vista was a little bit more beefy. Well, actually, it really hasn't changed much. It's 1 gigahertz processor, which is kind of joking today with today's power of the processors. 1 gig of RAM if it's a if it's a 32-bit operating system, 2 gigs of RAM if it's a 64-bit operating system. Vista required a little bit more in the fact that you had to have a 40 gig hard drive. They pretty much kept that the same, even though I've seen that Windows 7, Windows 8 and 8.1 really only take about 16 gigs to install, but just know 40 gig requirement for your hard drive as well. So a couple of things that you have to realize. Like I said, you say 1 gig of RAM and 1 gigahertz processor, most people would laugh at you today.
Yeah. Grab the old monster on the shelf that's been sitting around and be like, you know, I've meant to do something with that. It's not going to be installing Windows.
Yeah, and the other thing too is those are minimum requirements,
Yeah.
right? That doesn't necessarily mean that those are going to be requirements that are going to give you a great performance,
yeah.
right? When we call those the painful requirements, right? Because it's going to be painful to run the operating system.
You ever done it? You ever,
oh yeah,
you ever
absolutely.
put it on like the minimum requirements?
Yes, I have. I have run Vista on its bare minimum, and when I say bare minimum, it was 512 gigs or 512 megs of RAM.
Yeah.
Oh, and it was painful. So keep that in mind. So what happens if you don't know? You don't know what you need to install the operating system. Well, I'm going to give you guys a hint here. We have our practice labs out there that gives you access to do installs, different operating systems, and see this little hyperlink here? I want you to click it, right? I want you to click it, and I'll explain what custom comes and upgrade here in a second. But I want you to scroll through this, right? Notice what they tell you. Decide whether you're going to get a 32-bit or 64-bit. Depends on how much RAM you need access to. Today's day and age, there's really no reason to go with 32-bit unless you happen to have some kind of notebook or tablet that might be limiting to you. But notice you have all of this great information that they give you when it comes to exactly what it says, what to know before installing Windows. I would use that, and I have used that. I have told students that I've trained over the past 7 years or so in A+, to use this as part of your studies. All right, so moving on. All right, and again, I apologize for the matted lines here, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, this is WinPE. This isn't the operating system. We certainly aren't using the video drivers that are native to this graphics card. All right, now, next thing that we have is what's known as the EULA. All right.
Lawyer talk.
That's right, lawyer talk, right? And I'm going to go ahead and accept the terms, and that at the end of this episode, we're going to ask Dan what line 5501 subclause A is. All right. No,
Microsoft reserves the right to repeal one soul.
That's pretty good, Dan. You know, and in fact, what do we got for him, Johnny?
Yeah.
So we'll go ahead and push next. Keep in mind that you should be reading this information if you want to keep yourself out of any kind of legality, or you pay a lawyer. Just like Dan said, it's lawyer speak. You pay a lawyer to do it. But keep in mind that is your end user license agreement, and you will be bound by the words within that contract. All right. So it is important. Now, here's the option that you get. All right. And I want you to be very careful with this on the exam, because we're saying clean installation. Dan, can you show me where it says clean installation in these choices?
Yeah, no problem. Let me write it down right here. It doesn't say.
Exactly. It
doesn't say clean anywhere.
And that's always confused me.
Yeah.
A custom installation is installing a new copy of Windows. Be careful.
Yeah.
Exam alert. Because they might show you an exhibit that says, okay, you need to do a clean installation. Which one of these? And you won't know it if you've never installed it. So get in labs, use our practice labs that you guys have access to out there. Get your free trial versions of Windows that you can download the ISO files, and you can practice with this. But we're going to go ahead and do custom. We'll show you upgrade here in a second. If I was to run upgrade, it would tell me that I cannot run this, and I'll tell you why here in a second. All right, we're going to go ahead and go to custom. Now, here's a couple of things. This isn't so much for the exam that I want you to be aware of. Well, I guess portions of it. If you need to load third-party drivers, this is where you could do it. And let me tell you where this sometimes comes in handy. Sometimes Windows doesn't have, even though they're really good, Microsoft is really good about bundling in tons of drivers for all different types of hardware to at least allow you to install the operating system, so then you can download from the manufacturer's website additional drivers here. However, sometimes chipsets on motherboards, if you're using a RAID array and it has a RAID array controller, hardware controller in it, sometimes the drivers aren't recognized, and what happens here is this will be blank. And what that means is the Windows pre-installation environment, that memory resident operating system that's going to allow you to install the full-blown Windows, doesn't have the driver to your chipset for the motherboard, doesn't have the driver for the RAID array, and it doesn't show anything here. I've run into that. My Gigabyte board, one of the Gigabyte boards that I have right now, it doesn't show. So what I would have to do is I'd have to go to load driver, right? And when I click load driver, it'll tell me to install the driver. I can browse to it, all right? And then again, you can have like a USB thumb drive here, and you could plug it into the USB port on the computer, and then you could essentially browse to it. Now what you see here, boot, the X drive, if you will, that's actually the optical installation drive, if you will. It's kind of like a virtual drive. So I don't have it. Or you could scan it, and Windows will look. It's if we tried to scan, it's going to say no signed drivers were found. I'm not really worried about that because I can see that the storage space, the storage location, if you will, has showed up. Now, if you wanted to, you could also do partitioning here as well. And when we do partitioning, this would give us the ability to create and divide this space up the way we want. I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to say next to this. And when you do, it starts to expand the Windows files. Again, keep in mind that what we're talking about is we're talking about the WinP or pre-installation environment is actually loading the operating system, right? Dan talked about, I wouldn't even know what it was that you called it, right? I call it a drawer, a bureau. What did you call it?
An armoire.
Okay, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. That French thing, right? You open it up, right? And you're basically, you have all the different drawers and you're unpacking whatever it is that you want to, use. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. Right? Now, we've already got this turkey cooked, right? Because you've seen a deployment where we did image deployment. So I'm going to go ahead and let me just bump on over here and show you the post-installation options that you might need to be doing to finish the installation. All right. Notice we have Windows 7 Ultimate, right? This is just going to finish. It'll probably put us into, actually, this is the post-installation here. Got to make sure of that, right? So we're going to type the username. Keep in mind, I'll just put, because I am very creative, we'll just put student01, and I'll choose next. And what this is doing is setting up the very first user. You have to be careful because the very first user becomes the Windows administrator, not the default administrator. That account's been disabled since Vista. However, keep in mind that this is also going to be your administrative user that is allowed to click yes on any time a user account control comes up. So this is kind of a privileged account, if you will. And we're going to go ahead and type our password. And I think they matched, and we'll choose next. All right, now here's another option that you have, okay? Typing in your Windows product key, all right? I want you to be careful with this one because you notice I'm going to push skip. Why might I push skip? All right, well, here's how a product key works. When you do an installation, your product key gets tied to a hardware configuration. All right, part of this product key, during the installation process, the installation will take a blueprint, if you will, of all the hardware that's within the machine, and it'll create a hardware ID that is then with this product ID or key is going to be matched. The product ID is what Windows or Microsoft maintains. They have a database, all right, and that product ID is generated based on the product key that you put here, but they match. And then that is sent over to the Windows activation servers. And when the Windows activation servers, when Microsoft, if you will, looks at it in their database, they say, okay, has this installation ever been activated? Because you only get to activate it once. So what are they looking for? They're looking for the product identifier, which they already have that in their database. All right. They're also looking in their database to see if it's ever been activated, because if it's been activated, it has a hardware identifier that's also associated with it already. But in this case, since it's the first installation, it doesn't have a hardware identifier. So that package that I said, the product ID, the hardware ID, they get married together and they get sent over to the activation server. Now it has a hardware identifier associated with it, and it's going to store in the database. When that happens, they generate a third identifier that is then sent back to your machine and stored in the registry called an activation ID. And it's one of the things that the boot manager looks for every time the operating system boots up. It says, oh yeah, it's activated, you get full functionality. Now here's the thing. If you install this operating system and activate it now and have an activation ID, what happens if you're in the testing phase and you're just testing the operating system and you want to see, is Windows going to run adequately on the current hardware configuration that I have? And you say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and activate it, and then you find out that there are some pieces of the machine, the system unit, that you want to upgrade. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know where it starts and where it ends. But there is a point when you start upgrading pieces that, guess what? When the operating system, the boot manager loads up and it looks at the hardware profile, the hardware identifier associated with the activation ID, and that hardware identifier is going to be generated as something new because you've changed too many pieces as a different machine, the activation ID gets erased from the registry and you have to reactivate. And here's the problem. If I go back and I try to reactivate again and it's got a different hardware identifier, when that product ID and now let's say hardware identifier 2 get married together and sent to the activation server, Microsoft says, well, let's look at the product ID. Okay, I see the product ID. Again, keep in mind, they keep that in their database. But I also see hardware identifier 1 has already been associated with this product identifier, so no, activation fails. And guess what you have to do? You have to pay for a new copy of Windows. All right, now, it's not a bad thing to say skip. So some of you guys out there are probably going to try to send me hate mail saying, hey, you're skipping activation. I'm doing it on purpose. I'm doing it because I want to test the operating system. It is nothing illegal about Microsoft giving me a 30-day trial.
Well, I mean, they give you the option to skip it. If it was illegal to do, they
Absolutely.
would not give you that option.
And we call it the burn-in period, right? That's the burn-in period. You want to find out. Absolutely, right? We want to test drive this thing. And guess what? If it doesn't perform adequately, we upgrade. And then we reinstall the operating system. No big deal. We reinstall the operating system. We test it again. And if it runs correctly, if it runs within the means that it gives you the performance, then you activate it. Now, I say that, and that's a long rant on that, but let me tell you, that can save you a lot of money. And if nothing else, it can save you a lot of time on the phone talking to a person that's going to say, okay, well, let's go back and let's figure out what's going on. All right, here's your end user license agreement. Keep in mind the terms are the same, but they're a little bit different than because we did a deployment over the network versus a local installation. So we're going to go ahead and choose next. Next thing we have is how to protect your operating system, right? Well, one of the ways that we protect our operating system is to use recommended settings, and this is basically the dynamic security that will be built into Windows, including updates. Notice it says making the Windows internet browsing safer. This turns on things like the smart screen filter, turns on your security zones, which we'll look at in control panel configurations coming up in another episode, and then check online for solutions to problems. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'll just say use recommended time or recommended settings. All right, now by default, when you review your date and time settings, please understand that your date, time, we've looked at language already and regional settings. Keep this in mind that it always defaults to Bill Gates land or California time, Pacific time. I'm going to go ahead and for the purposes of just our demonstration here, I'm going to change it because we're on the Eastern time zone. Whatever you're doing out there, if you're following along in the labs, change it to your local time, right? It certainly isn't going to hurt anything. All right, we'll choose next, and we'll let it finish its installation, right? Now, what it did in the background is it essentially what it did was created the user profile. All right, now I'm going to go ahead and log on, and you remember I told you the answer file? Notice that this computer's already joined to the domain. Hopefully, we're going to keep our fingers crossed, it is already joined to the domain. And I'll show you, ladies and gentlemen out there, what I mean when I say work group versus domain. We got to kind of talk about that. Now, it says preparing the desktop. What is going on here in the background? Well, you have what's known inside of Windows as a default profile. And the default profile is all of the locations that you find in the user profile, but they're all blank. And what that means is it's going to take the name that you applied, in this case, Student 01, all right, and it's going to essentially pull down the default profile, copy it, and then apply Student 01. And now that's Student 01, in this case, is local directory and locations. Now, you might have to install things like third-party drivers, right? Where might we do that? All right, let's go ahead and we're going to push our Start button, and we're going to go to Control Panel. We're going to go to System and Security, Administrative Tools, and we've talked heavily about this in other episodes, so we're kind of going through this fast. If you don't know where these locations are, go check out some of the tools that we've talked about. We're going to go to Computer Management. Here in Computer Management, I'm looking for something known as Device Manager. When I open up Device Manager, I will see that I have some things that aren't recognized right away. You can always tell that when you have other devices. When I have other devices, what that means is that it doesn't know what those other devices are. Notice how it categorized everything here? It means there's something in this hardware that it doesn't recognize, and I can usually find that out by a little question mark, and I can right-click on this device, and I can choose Properties. Notice what it says. Drivers for this device are not installed. All right, that happens because Windows doesn't have it pre-built in, so you have to install those drivers. All right, now I'm going to kind of cheat the system a little bit here, and one of the things that you might notice is that it's going to install third-party drivers. So we're going to go ahead, in this case, we're going to install some tools, and we're going to install VMware's third-party drivers to get this machine operational. All right, so I went ahead and kind of simulated, kind of throwing the driver disk, if you will, into the optical tray. We're going to go to Computer, and we're going to run the software, and it's going to prepare for installation. Now, while this is installing, I want to talk about two other things here that we really haven't talked about yet. All right, and one of those is something known as a factory recovery partition, or just in general a recovery partition, because I mentioned something known as a repair installation. Well, you also have the ability for a manufacturer to create a protected partition that in your one-time boot menu, when you do your boot method, you actually point it to the recovery partition, and it has an image on your system that you can pull down and re-image this hard drive from bare metal, just like we did when Dan and I showed you the image deployment.
It is a sweet, sweet thing, my man, because anytime it happens, right? You get to kicking around inside your operating system and you kind of hose it up pretty hard. And what do? Well, you've got this lovely recovery image, and you just go right back to a good, clean place that you know that the operating system worked.
Most definitely, yeah. It saves you a ton of nightmares. So let's go ahead, and again, every one of these is going to be specific to the installation that you do. Let's go ahead and just kind of do it basic and show you how all of a sudden the video drivers are recognized, right? So we'll go ahead and we'll do our basic install, and it's going to come through. Hopefully it won't take too long here, but again, keep in mind that with third party, they're not going to expect you to know all the different third parties, but they're going to want you to know the basic process that we showed you here with Device Manager. That's the first place I go. If I'm doing installations, I don't even care if it's a remote deployment. I will try to connect to the machine and verify that on the server side, and this is how I tell, that I've configured the server side appropriately, because you put driver packages up there, and I want to know, did one of the machines pull down its driver package? Because if they're identical, chances are they're going to pull them down from every other machine, but it's never any guarantees, right?
Yeah, Wes, I typically use the Device Manager as like a checklist of, okay, I've got a bunch of nice little exclamation points here. Let's take them one at a time, because in virtual machines, it's usually very nice, like what Wes is showing you right now. You install the virtual machine tool set of whatever that is, and all your drivers are there, and everything works great. If you're working with hardware from a manufacturer, someone like Dell, they'll send you a driver CD or a DVD, and if you lose that, you can get it from their website, but it can be very daunting. What do I have? You have to put in your service tag, and on their website at the support.dell.com, find out what machine you have, find out what drivers you have for the actual hardware inside of the machine, download those things, put it on a USB, plug it in, and then start walking through a bunch of installations. It can be a bit time consuming, so trying to find any way you can to speed that up or keep a repository of drivers at your ready can be very helpful.
Yeah, and that's one of the features that I love on at least on the Windows Deployment Services side, is that you can put all those driver packages up, like you said, in a repository, and what happens is the machines are smart enough to communicate, and the server will say, oh, I see you're an I don't know, let's say an OptiPlex 980. Well, you need these drivers. Here, take them. They're already there, and we don't have to do all of that. So you can see that we don't have any matted lines here anymore. I'm gonna shoot from the hip on this one and see if we go back to Device Manager, and wow. So all of a sudden, other devices become system devices,
Yes.
right? So notice, Dan, right here, hopefully, notice that I don't have the other devices category anymore. And that's because they're all recognized, even though you can't recognize them out there because I'm all over the place. Notice that they're gone, right? And the last thing to do on this would be a restart, okay? And I'm not going to really bore you guys there with a restart here, but Dan, it does look like I've kind of taken up your time, because I still want to show you kind of like an upgrade, and some of the things that they talk about are some of the file systems that you have to be aware of and the disk types, because you got to know if you're going to partition a machine, what kind of partitions are you going to use?
Well, it sounds like fun, Wes. Looking forward to it. This has been a really great episode, and we do thank you for your time. We thank you good folks out there for watching, so come on back for part 3. It's going to be a lot of good information in that episode. As for this episode, it is time for us to sign off. For IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Daniel Lowry.
And I'm Wes Bryan.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.